There are things in this world that cannot be explained by logic, things that medicine cannot cure, things that should have stayed buried. Thomas Carter learned this the hard way on a cold October night, when he found a handwritten note tucked inside the medical supply cabinet of his ambulance. 7 words that made no sense. 7 words that would haunt him forever. 7 words written in the handwriting of a patient who had died 3 days earlier. Thomas had been a paramedic for 12 years. He had seen death in all its forms. He had held the hands of the dying, closed the eyes of the departed, and carried the weight of lives he could not save. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what was about to happen in the corridors of St. Michael Hospital that night. It started with a routine call, a woman in her late 60s, chest pains, difficulty breathing, standard procedure. Thomas and his partner, Rebecca Hayes, arrived at the small apartment on Maple Street at exactly 11:47. The woman was conscious but pale, her lips tinged with blue, her breath shallow and labored. Her name was Margaret Holloway, a retired nurse, widowed, no children, no family, just her and the fading photographs on the walls of a life that once was. They loaded her into the ambulance. Rebecca started the oxygen. Thomas checked her vitals. Heart rate erratic, blood pressure dropping. They needed to move fast. But as Thomas reached for the medical kit, his hand brushed against something that should not have been there. A folded piece of paper. Yellow. Old. The kind of paper that smells like dust and forgotten memories. He opened it. His hands froze. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. He had seen it before. 3 days ago. On a medical consent form signed by a patient named David Grayson. A man who had died of cardiac arrest in the back of this very same ambulance. A man whose body Thomas had personally transported to the morgue. A man who could not possibly have written this note. Because the dead do not write, the dead do not warn, the dead do not remember. But the note was there. Real. Tangible. And it said only this: "She knows what you did. Tell her you are sorry, before midnight, or she will take you with her." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. His heart pounded against his ribs like a prisoner trying to escape. He looked at Margaret Holloway lying on the stretcher, her eyes closed, her breathing weak. Who was she? What did she know? And what did David Grayson, a man he had barely spoken to, a man who died before reaching the hospital, have to do with any of this? Rebecca noticed his expression, asked if he was okay. He lied, said he was fine, folded the note and shoved it into his pocket. But his mind was racing. His hands were trembling. And deep down, in a place he did not want to acknowledge, he knew. He knew this was not a coincidence. He knew this was not a mistake. He knew that something dark, something ancient, something beyond the realm of the living, had reached out from the other side. And it wanted something from him. The ambulance doors slammed shut. The engine roared to life. The city lights blurred into streaks of yellow and white as they sped towards St. Michael Hospital. But Thomas was no longer thinking about saving Margaret Holloway. He was thinking about the note. He was thinking about David Grayson. He was thinking about a secret he had buried so deep. He thought no one would ever find it. A secret that had followed him for years. A secret that whispered in the dark corners of his mind every single night. A secret that, apparently, the dead knew about. Because if the dead were speaking, then someone was listening. And if someone was listening, then judgment was coming. And judgment, Thomas knew, did not forgive. Now before we continue, I need you to ask yourself something. Have you ever kept a secret so terrible, so consuming, that it felt like it was eating you alive from the inside? Because that is exactly what Thomas Carter was living with. And tonight, that secret was about to be exposed in the most terrifying way imaginable. St. Michael Hospital stood like a silent sentinel against the night sky. Its walls had witnessed decades of suffering, healing, miracles, and deaths. It was the kind of place where hope and despair existed side by side, separated only by a thin curtain and the rhythm of a heart monitor. Thomas had been bringing patients here for years. He knew every corridor, every door, every face behind the reception desk. But tonight, as the ambulance pulled into the emergency bay, the hospital felt different. Colder, darker, as if the building itself was holding its breath. They wheeled Margaret Holloway through the automatic doors. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile white glow on everything. The smell of disinfectant mixed with something else. Something metallic. Something that reminded Thomas of the morgue. He tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to him like a second skin. Dr. Elena Marsh met them at the trauma bay. She was efficient, professional, and unshakable. She had been working the night shift for 15 years and had seen everything the city could throw at her. She took one look at Margaret and immediately started barking orders. IV line, EKG, blood work, oxygen levels. The medical team moved like a well-rehearsed orchestra, each person knowing their part without needing to be told. Thomas stepped back. His job was done. He should have left. Should have returned to the ambulance. Should have moved on to the next call. But he could not move. His feet felt like they were nailed to the floor. His hand was still in his pocket, fingers wrapped around the folded note. The words burned in his mind. She knows what you did. Tell her you are sorry, before midnight, or she will take you with her. He looked at Margaret Holloway. Her eyes were still closed. Her face was peaceful, almost serene, as if she had already accepted whatever was coming. But there was something about her. Something in the way her lips moved slightly, as if she was whispering to someone only she could see. Something in the way her fingers twitched, reaching for something invisible in the air. Rebecca touched his shoulder, asked if he was coming. He nodded, but he did not follow her. Instead, he walked toward the bed. Closer, closer, until he was standing right next to Margaret. He leaned down, listened, and that is when he heard it. A whisper, barely audible, barely human, but unmistakable. David says hello. Thomas stumbled backward. His heart was racing, his vision blurred. How did she know? How could she possibly know? He had never met this woman before tonight. He had never spoken to her. He had never told anyone about David Grayson, about what happened in the ambulance 3 days ago, about the choice he had made, the choice that haunted him every single night. Dr. Marsh turned to him, asked if he was all right. He lied again, said he was fine, said he just needed some air. He walked out of the trauma bay, down the corridor, past the waiting room filled with worried faces and tear-streaked cheeks. He walked until he found himself in the chapel, a small, quiet room at the end of the East Wing, a place where families came to pray for miracles, a place where hope went to die. He sat in the front pew, stared at the wooden cross on the wall, tried to remember how to breathe, but all he could think about was that night 3 days ago. The night David Grayson died in his ambulance, the night everything changed. David had been having a heart attack, a bad one. Thomas had done everything by the book, administered medication, performed CPR, called ahead to the hospital. But David had been conscious, struggling, gasping. And in those final moments, he had grabbed Thomas by the arm, pulled him close, and said something Thomas would never forget. I know what you did to her. I know you left her. I know she died alone. And you will pay for it. You will pay. Thomas had been stunned, confused. How did this dying man know about Emma, about his wife, about the night she called him, begging him to come home, telling him she could not breathe, that something was wrong, that she needed him? And Thomas had been at work, had been in the middle of a shift, had told her to call another ambulance, had told her he could not leave, had told her she would be fine. But she was not fine. By the time help arrived, Emma Carter was already gone. Cardiac arrest. Just like David Grayson. Just like Margaret Holloway. The same way. The same symptom. The same ending. And Thomas had never forgiven himself. Had never told anyone the truth. Had buried it deep inside where guilt and shame could feast on it in silence. But somehow, impossibly, David Grayson had known. And now, 3 days after his death, his words were coming back. Through a note. Through a stranger. Through a woman who should not know anything about Thomas Carter or his dead wife. The chapel door creaked open. Footsteps echoed on the tile floor. Thomas turned. It was Father Anthony, an elderly priest who had been at St. Michael for as long as anyone could remember. He sat down next to Thomas without saying a word. Just sat there, present, patient, waiting. Thomas wanted to speak, wanted to confess, wanted to ask for forgiveness, but the words would not come. Instead, he pulled out the note, handed it to Father Anthony, watched as the old priest unfolded it, read it, and then, slowly, very slowly, looked up at Thomas with eyes that held more sadness than judgment. "You know who wrote this," Father Anthony said. It was not a question, it was a statement, a truth spoken into existence. Thomas nodded. His voice was barely a whisper. "A man who died 3 days ago. In my ambulance. But that is impossible. The dead cannot write. The dead cannot warn. The dead cannot remember." Father Anthony folded the note, handed it back, and then he said something that made Thomas' blood run cold. "The dead remember everything, my son, especially the debts we owe. And tonight, someone is here to collect." Thomas left the chapel. His mind was spinning. His hands were shaking. The clock on the wall read 11:32. 28 minutes until midnight. 28 minutes until whatever was supposed to happen would happen. He did not believe in curses. Did not believe in ghosts. Did not believe that the dead could reach across the veil and touch the living. But he believed in guilt. And guilt, he knew, could make a man see things that were not there. Could make a man hear voices in the silence. Could make a man destroy himself from the inside out. He walked back toward the trauma bay. He needed to see Margaret Holloway again. Needed to look into her eyes and know if she was real or if she was something else. Something sent. Something designed to punish him. Something that knew his deepest, darkest secret. But when he reached the trauma bay, it was empty. The bed was still there. The monitors were still beeping. But Margaret was gone. Dr. Marsh was nowhere to be seen. The nurses were gone. The entire emergency department, which had been buzzing with activity just minutes ago, was now silent. Deserted. As if everyone had simply vanished into thin air. Thomas' heart pounded in his chest. He walked down the corridor. His footsteps echoed in the emptiness. The fluorescent lights flickered, once, twice, then went out completely. Darkness swallowed him whole. He fumbled for his phone, turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the black like a knife, and that is when he saw her. Margaret Holloway, standing at the end of the hallway, facing him. But she was not the frail, dying woman he had brought in. She was standing upright, strong. Her hospital gown hung loosely on her frame, but her eyes were wide open, and they were not the eyes of the living. They were empty, hollow, black as the void between stars. She raised her hand, pointed at him, and then she spoke. But it was not her voice. It was David Grayson's voice, the voice of the dead man, the voice of judgment. "You let her die, Thomas. You let Emma die. You chose your job over your wife. You chose strangers over the woman who loved you. You told her to wait. You told her to call someone else. You told her she would be fine. But she was not fine. She died alone, scared, calling your name. And you were not there." Thomas tried to speak, tried to deny it, tried to explain. But the words caught in his throat like shards of glass. Because it was true. Every single word was true. He had made that choice. He had told Emma to wait. He had prioritized his duty over his love, and she had died because of it. Margaret took a step forward, then another. Her movements were wrong, jerky, unnatural, as if something else was controlling her body, as if she was a puppet and the strings were being pulled by invisible hands. "You need to apologize, Thomas. You need to say the words. You need to tell her you are sorry before midnight, or you will join us. You will walk in the space between life and death. You will know what it feels like to be abandoned, to be forgotten, to die alone." Thomas backed away. His mind was screaming. His body was frozen. He wanted to run, wanted to escape, but his legs would not move. And then from behind him, he heard another voice. A voice he had not heard in 3 years. A voice he thought he would never hear again. Thomas. He turned, slowly, painfully. And there she was, Emma, his wife, standing in the middle of the corridor. She looked exactly as she had the last time he saw her. Before the funeral, before the guilt, before the endless nights of regret. She was wearing the blue dress she loved. Her hair was tied back. Her face was pale but peaceful. Tears streamed down Thomas' face. He wanted to run to her, wanted to hold her, wanted to beg for forgiveness. But he could not move, could not breathe, could not think. Emma walked toward him. Her footsteps made no sound. She stopped a few feet away, looked at him with eyes that held no anger, no resentment, only sadness, only loss. You were not there, Thomas. I needed you. I called you. I begged you, and you chose them over me. You chose people you did not know over the person who knew you better than anyone. I died waiting for you. I died hoping you would come. I died believing you loved me. But you did not love me enough. Thomas fell to his knees. His entire body was shaking. Sobs tore through him like knives. He had carried this guilt for 3 years, had buried it, had tried to forget it, but it had never left. It had festered. It had grown. It had become a living thing inside him. And now it was demanding to be acknowledged. I am sorry, he whispered. I am so sorry, Emma. I should have come. I should have been there. I should have chosen you. I was wrong. I was selfish. I was a coward. And I have hated myself every single day since you died. Please, please forgive me. Emma knelt down in front of him, reached out her hand, touched his face. Her fingers were cold, so cold, like ice, like death. You need to forgive yourself, Thomas. That is the only way to be free. You need to let go of the guilt. You need to stop punishing yourself, because I forgave you a long time ago. I forgave you the moment I closed my eyes. I forgave you because I loved you. And I still do. The clock on the wall chimed. Midnight. The sound echoed through the empty hospital like a death knell. And then, everything went silent. Emma was gone. Margaret was gone. The lights came back on. The sounds of the hospital returned. Voices, footsteps, machines, life. Thomas was alone in the corridor, on his knees, tears streaming down his face. The note was still in his hand, but when he looked at it, the words had changed. They now read only this: You are forgiven. Let go. Thomas stood up slowly. His legs felt weak. His mind was struggling to process what had just happened. Had it been real? Had Emma truly appeared to him? Or had his guilt finally broken him completely? He looked around the corridor. Everything seemed normal now. Doctors walking past. Nurses chatting at their stations. Patients being wheeled on gurneys. The hospital had returned to its usual rhythm, as if nothing had happened, as if the last hour had been nothing more than a fever dream. He walked to the reception desk, asked about Margaret Holloway. The nurse looked at him with confusion, checked the computer, shook her head, said there was no patient by that name, said no elderly woman with chest pains had been admitted tonight, said he must be mistaken. Thomas felt the ground shift beneath him. He insisted, told her about the call, about Maple Street, about bringing Margaret in less than an hour ago. But the nurse was adamant. No record, no admission, no Margaret Holloway. She suggested he check with his dispatch. Maybe there had been a mix-up with the paperwork. He pulled out his phone, called Rebecca. She answered on the second ring. He asked her about the patient they had just brought in. There was a long pause. Then Rebecca's voice came back, confused and concerned. Thomas, we have not had a call in over 2 hours. Our last transport was at 9:15, a kid with a broken arm. You have been sitting in the ambulance the entire time. Are you feeling okay? Thomas' heart stopped. That was impossible. He had been inside the hospital. He had spoken to Dr. Marsh. He had seen Margaret. He had seen Emma. It had been real. It had to be real. He could still feel the cold touch of Emma's fingers on his face. Could still hear David Grayson's voice coming from Margaret's mouth. Could still see the darkness that had swallowed the hospital whole. He ran outside, back to the ambulance, threw open the back doors. And there it was, the medical supply cabinet, the same one where he had found the note. He opened it, looked inside, and his blood turned to ice. There were dozens of notes, hundreds, all folded in the same way, all written on the same yellow paper, all in the same shaky handwriting. He grabbed one, opened it. It said the same thing as the first. She knows what you did. Tell her you are sorry. Before midnight, or she will take you with her. He grabbed another, same message, and another, and another. Every single one identical. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was the date written at the bottom of each note. October 18th, 3 years ago, the night Emma died. Thomas stumbled backward. His mind was fracturing. None of this made sense. David Grayson had not written these notes. David Grayson had died 3 days ago. These notes were 3 years old, which meant they had been here the entire time, hidden, waiting. But who had written them, and why? He heard footsteps behind him. Turned. It was Father Anthony. The priest was holding something in his hands, a small leather-bound journal. He handed it to Thomas without saying a word. Thomas opened it. The first page had a name written at the top, Emma Louise Carter. It was her journal, her handwriting, her thoughts. He had never seen it before, had never known she kept one. He flipped through the pages, read the entries, and with each word his heart broke a little more. The entries were from the months before her death. She wrote about feeling alone, about feeling abandoned, about calling Thomas at work and being told to wait, about chest pains that came and went, about being scared, about sensing that something was wrong with her body but being told by doctors that she was fine, that it was just stress, that she needed to relax. And then he reached the final entry, the night she died. The words were shaky, written in obvious pain. I called Thomas again, told him I could not breathe, told him I was scared. He said he was busy, said he would come after his shift, said I should call another ambulance if it was that bad. But I do not want another ambulance. I want my husband. I want the man I married, the man who promised to always be there. But he is not here. He is never here. And I think this is it. I think I am going to die. And I will die knowing that I was not enough, that strangers were more important, that his job mattered more than I did. If I do not make it through tonight, I want him to know something. I forgive him, because I love him. But I also want him to know what it feels like, to be alone, to call for help and have no one come, to realize that the person you trusted most in the world is not going to save you. The entry ended there. Thomas' hands were shaking so violently he almost dropped the journal. Tears blurred his vision. Emma had written those words minutes before she died, minutes before her heart gave out, and somehow those words had manifested, had become real, had created the notes, had created Margaret, had created everything that happened tonight. Father Anthony spoke quietly. Your wife did not curse you, Thomas. She tried to teach you. She wanted you to feel what she felt, not out of revenge, but out of love, so you would understand, so you would change, so you would never let anyone else die alone the way she did. Thomas looked at the priest. His voice was broken. But Margaret Holloway, the ambulance call, David Grayson, were they real? Father Anthony shook his head slowly. David Grayson was real. He did die in your ambulance 3 days ago, but he did not write those notes. You found them that night because your guilt finally allowed you to see them. They had always been there, waiting. And Margaret Holloway was never a patient. She was a messenger, a manifestation of your conscience, a mirror showing you what you refused to see, that you have been punishing yourself for 3 years, that you have been living in a prison of your own making, that the only person who has not forgiven you is you. Thomas fell against the ambulance. His entire world had collapsed. Everything he thought had happened tonight had been a lie. Or rather, it had been a truth disguised as a lie. A supernatural intervention designed not to damn him, but to save him. Emma had reached out from beyond death not to take him with her, but to set him free. He looked down at the journal, at Emma's final words. I forgive him. And suddenly, he understood. Emma had always forgiven him. The universe had forgiven him. God had forgiven him. The only person holding on to the guilt, feeding it, letting it destroy him piece by piece, was Thomas himself. The weeks that followed that night were different for Thomas Carter. He returned to work, continued saving lives, continued answering calls, continued doing the job he had devoted his life to. But something fundamental had changed inside him. The weight that had pressed down on his chest for 3 years, the invisible stone that had made every breath feel like a struggle, was gone. Not completely. Guilt like that never fully disappears, but it had transformed. It had become something else, something bearable, something that no longer controlled him. He visited Emma's grave every Sunday, brought flowers, sat on the grass, talked to her the way he should have talked to her when she was alive. He told her about his day, about the patients he saved, about the ones he could not, about his fears, about his regrets, about his hope that somehow, somewhere, she could hear him. And whether she could or not, the act of speaking to her brought him peace. He also started doing something he had never done before. When he arrived at a scene, when he loaded a patient into the ambulance, he looked them in the eyes. Really looked. Saw them not as a case, not as a medical emergency, not as another number on his shift report, but as a person. Someone with a story, someone with people who loved them, someone who mattered. And he made sure they knew, in those critical moments, that they were not alone. One night, 6 months after the incident at St. Michael Hospital, Thomas received a call. Elderly man, cardiac arrest. The address was on Maple Street, the same street where he had picked up the phantom Margaret Holloway. He felt a chill run down his spine, but he went, because that was his job. Because someone needed him. Because he had learned that running from fear only makes it stronger. When he arrived, the man was unconscious. His wife was beside him, crying, holding his hand. Thomas and Rebecca worked quickly, started CPR, administered medication, loaded him into the ambulance, and as they sped toward the hospital, the man opened his eyes, looked at Thomas, and whispered something that made Thomas' heart skip a beat. "Thank you for coming. I was afraid I would die alone." Thomas held the man's hand, looked him in the eyes, and said the words he wished he had said to Emma 3 years ago. "You are not alone. I am here, and I am not going anywhere." The man survived, made a full recovery. His wife sent Thomas a letter weeks later, thanking him for saving her husband's life. But what she did not know, what no one knew, was that Thomas had not just saved that man. That man had saved Thomas, had reminded him why he became a paramedic in the first place. Not to carry guilt, not to punish himself, but to be present, to show up, to be the person someone needs in their darkest moment. Father Anthony visited Thomas one afternoon. They sat in the hospital cafeteria, drinking terrible coffee, talking about life and death and everything in between. Thomas asked the question that had been haunting him for months. "Do you think Emma orchestrated all of this? Do you think she reached out from the other side to teach me a lesson?" Father Anthony smiled. A sad, knowing smile. "I think love transcends death, Thomas. I think the bond between two souls does not end just because one stops breathing. Whether Emma's spirit guided you, whether it was your subconscious mind creating a narrative to force you to confront your guilt, or whether it was divine intervention, does not really matter. What matters is that you listened, you changed, you forgave yourself, and in doing so, you honored her memory in the most meaningful way possible." Thomas nodded. He understood now. Fear had been his companion for 3 years. Fear of facing what he had done, fear of admitting his failure, fear of forgiving himself. But that fear had also been a gift. It had kept Emma alive in his mind, had forced him to remember, had pushed him toward redemption, and in the end, it had saved him. He thought about David Grayson, the man who had died in his ambulance 3 days before the incident, the man whose voice had come through Margaret Holloway. Thomas had looked into David's file, discovered that David had lost his own wife years earlier, had blamed himself, had carried guilt until the day he died. And in his final moments, when he grabbed Thomas' arm and said those haunting words, he had not been condemning Thomas. He had been warning him, had been trying to save him from the same fate, from a life consumed by regret. That is the thing about the dead. They do not haunt us to punish us. They haunt us to remind us, to teach us, to push us toward the light when we are walking too close to the darkness. And if we are wise, if we are brave enough to listen, they can change us. They can heal us. They can set us free. Thomas still has Emma's journal, keeps it in the glove compartment of the ambulance. Sometimes, on quiet nights, he reads her final entry, reminds himself of what she wanted him to learn. That presence matters more than perfection. That love requires showing up, even when it is inconvenient. That the people we care about deserve our time, our attention, our vulnerability. And that forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness, is not a betrayal of the dead. It is a way of honoring them, a way of saying their life and their death meant something. So if you are listening to this story, if you have stayed with me until the end, I want you to ask yourself something. Is there someone in your life you need to forgive? Is there a mistake you have been carrying for too long? Is there a conversation you need to have before it is too late? Because the dead cannot speak, but their silence can be the loudest teacher of all. Do not wait for a supernatural intervention. Do not wait for a note from the grave. Do not wait until midnight strikes and judgment comes knocking. Choose now. Choose forgiveness. Choose presence. Choose love. Leave a comment below. Tell me about a moment when you realized you needed to let go of guilt. Tell me about someone you wish you had told you were sorry. Tell me what fear has taught you. Because your story matters. And maybe, just maybe, sharing it will set someone else free. In the end, perhaps the real miracle was fear, as